today. We're going to have a talk by Professor Thomas Calobrisi. We had him at the Orange County Buddhist Church over the summer, and this is kind of a follow-up to the presentations he did then. He really explored what makes something Buddhist and what is authentic and what activities at our temples, are they all Buddhist or some of them social, or maybe they're both? And so we're going to explore that today. As Andy mentioned, you can find Everyday Buddhist on Facebook, Instagram, and we also have our own YouTube channel. And we will record his presentation today. So if you want to keep your privacy, make sure you turn off your camera and certainly turn off your microphone for the sound. And then after his presentation, we'll stop recording, and then we'll open it up to question and answer, discussion, and dialogue, which I think is just as valuable and as important as the presentation itself. So these are what we call our free online live events. We have one a month. We're trying to build a sense of community. So it's not just online consumption of content, but you can ask questions, send feedback, watch our content on social media. You can receive a weekly blog every Wednesday, and then consume the online content, and also visit and come together as a community every month to explore different topics in Buddhism in real time. And we've got a lot of feedback from our subscribers that they really appreciate that, especially many of them don't live near a temple, and they kind of need to be able to be part of a Sangha from home. So this is our monthly live event. It's titled What Makes Buddhism Buddhist? With Thomas Calobrisi. Thomas Calobrisi is a research fellow at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, where he teaches courses on Buddhist history, literature, and ethics. Today, he will help us explore and answer the question, what makes something Buddhist? Can flower arranging be Buddhist? What about basketball? In this presentation, we will explore these questions by looking to see how Buddhists have incorporated stories from broader Indian and Chinese culture into foundational narratives. By showing how things become Buddhist, we can see with a new perspective what it means to be Buddhist, allowing us to more effectively navigate conversations around authenticity, tradition, and culture in our communities. So I'm going to stop sharing and welcome a very important professor at the Institute of Buddhist Studies. This is where it's kind of our seminary and academic institution. Most ministers have attended this and graduated from it. And I think having Dr. Calabrese there is going to be a really important addition to the training of new ministers in the BCA.
Okay, on to me. Wow, thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction. Let me get myself set up here just a little bit so that I set my timer. All right, we start 30 minutes. And let me start my share here real quick. Get that going again. Okay. Are we seeing the PowerPoint presentation here? What makes Buddhism Buddhist?
Yeah, it looks great. Thank you, Sensei.
Okay. All right, so it's April 9th, 2026. This presentation is for Everyday Buddhist. Thank you so much for having me. And let's see if I can get that. Okay, there it goes. It gets rolling. Okay, just a little bit about myself. Reverend John already gave me a very kind introduction, but just to reiterate, my name is Thomas Calabrisi. I am a research fellow at the Institute of Buddhist Studies. I've been teaching there since 2021, so about 5 years now. And I think in my role, I see myself as a teacher, a mentor, and an author. I teach classes, I work with students on their research, and I conduct my own research. I've been in the process of writing a book. Maybe we can have a book talk at some point in the future. And I'm like, also like, writing articles, things like that, doing things like this as well, speaking to the public. So that's sort of my role, what I do there. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today to share in what I've been thinking about for many years. So we're going to get down to the nitty gritty. What's the point? Why am I here? What am I here to tell you? We did get a little bit of description of what's going on today from Reverend John already, but I just want to encapsulate my claim to you today really quickly, and that is things become Buddhist by enculturation, right? This is something of a $10 word, enculturation. What exactly does it mean? I want to give you a little definition here. It says enculturation is the process by which people learn the dynamics of their surrounding culture and acquire the values and norms appropriate or necessary to that culture and its worldview. So today, I'm going to use enculturation not for people necessarily, but for artifacts like narratives, practices, ideas, um, texts, right? These are the sorts of things I'm thinking about when I'm talking about enculturation and how things become Buddhist. People become Buddhist in the same way. They learn the underlying values and worldview of Buddhism, and they begin to apply it in their life, right? So in the same way, I think practices, texts, ideas can also become Buddhist in much the same way when they're incorporated into it, when they're enculturated into it, right? So to iterate it just another way, things are neither Buddhist nor non-Buddhist, but they become Buddhist through acculturation, right? That's kind of the big point that I have here for you today, laying it all there right up front so you understand exactly what I'm trying to drive at. And in what follows here, I'm going to give you several different examples of the process of enculturation that I'm thinking about, but I want to give something of a sort of caveat auditor or a warning or notice to the audience that in this process, well, these examples I'm talking about are over several centuries of time. These enculturation processes happened, right? And I've only got 30 minutes. Now I've only got 26 to speak to you about all these things, right? So, of necessity, I will be speaking in some broad generalities. The nuances, some of the nuances may be lost in necessarily getting out the essential points, but maybe we can get into some of the more detailed points in the Q&A if you want. But I just want to let you know that, I'm talking about a huge sweep of history here. And so sometimes nuances will be lost in the process. But the general point is that we see this enculturation process happen in different parts of Buddhist history across Asia. And so here I want to get to some of my examples. The first one is the five precepts. And what are these precepts? The first is to refrain from taking life, to refrain from stealing, to refrain from sexual misconduct, to refrain from lying, and to refrain from intoxicants, right? And I think it's not an uncontroversial point to say that they're pretty definitively Buddhist, right? They've been incorporated into a number of rituals. You're reciting them, practicing them, understanding them, applying them in one's life in various ways. It's been seen as central to Buddhist life and practice for many, many centuries, such that now we see these as a definitive core of the tradition. Um, Whether they're always practiced by every Buddhist all the time or not is not not a question here, but that come to be seen as so important is kind of the point, right? However, if we were to look to the ancient Indian context in which Buddhism emerged, you would find that not only the Buddhists, but the Jains and the Hindus as well, or what we refer to as Brahmins, had versions of these precepts as well. Sometimes there were just four, sometimes there were five. They may have switched one or another. And then they also switched the order as well in terms of priority, though usually taking life or refraining from taking life is conceived as the first precept, right? To practice nonviolence, right, is seen as an essential part of an ethical practice. But the point is here that we have all these various traditions saying or incorporating what are actually a broad, like pan-Indian form of ethical practice, right? These are sort of basic precepts for life, even though many of us will break one or another on any given day, right? But they're seen as the baseline for morality, and every tradition took these up and did them in their own way. And to illustrate this point, I wanted to grab a quote from the scholar Stephen Collins, the late Stephen Collins, in his posthumous book, Wisdom as a Way of Life. I highly recommend this book, by the way. It is a bit scholarly, but if you're looking into a new way to understand the Buddhist tradition, particularly the Theravada tradition, his work is indispensable. It changed the way that I think about a lot of things. Nevertheless, I want to pull on this quote here. And what he's basically driving at here is that both, for example, he's talking about the first precept there to refrain from taking life or to refrain from harming, right? And that Buddhists and Jains made the same sort of precept and they made it equally primary. It was always the first, right? And well, what he's saying here is that when these different traditions sermonize about nonviolence or non-harming or not killing in their own kinds of systematic thought, in their own worldview, and do so within their own institutions, their temples and monasteries and so on, this precept not to kill becomes what he says separately and complementarily both Buddhist and Jain. It's there's a Buddhist way of doing it, there's a Jain way of doing it. And how that happens is through this process of what I'm referring to as enculturation, how he puts it as sermonized in relation to their own kinds of systematic thought in their own buildings, temples, and monasteries, and so on. Right. So this is my first example is the 5 precepts. The next example here I have are the Jatakas or birth stories of the Buddha. There's some 600 of these across various traditions, and they're recognized as part of the Buddhist canon in various traditions: Pali, Sanskrit language literature, Chinese language literature, Tibetan language literature. They all have some version of these stories. The Pali tradition and the Theravada tradition that holds that has the largest collection of about 540, almost 550. I think it's 547 is the total. So we kind of know them best from that Pali tradition. However, many of the stories that are included here began as folk stories. They were actually circulated not just across India, but across the Eurasian continent, right? They're found in Indian sources like the Hindu Panchatantra, but also in Aesop's fables, right? One example here is, I think it comes to us in English as Chicken Little, where somebody freaks out that the sky is falling and convinces everyone else that the sky is falling. And finally, one animal in the group says, "Hey, wait a minute! Like, what's going on here? Have we all lost our minds?" Right. So that story is also a Jataka tale. Um, in this case, it's not a chicken who stops everybody, or it's a rabbit who freaks out, and a lion who stops everybody from running into the ocean to avoid the sky falling on them. Uh, but so many of them were sort of folk tales that were appropriated into a Buddhist sphere and given a sort of Buddhist gloss. And they were you know, inaugurated or integrated into Buddhist literature as a distinct genre that actually had specific purposes. And they were used in many cases to understand and reflect on the virtues of a Buddha, on the life or the career of a bodhisattva, what they are supposed to do, how they're supposed to do it in order to become a Buddha after many, 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 many lifetimes of practice, of sacrifice, of gaining understanding, gaining wisdom, things like that. So these stories are not just they're not simply folk tales, right? But they actually had a interesting and like integral purpose to formulating who or what the character of a Buddha is and what the Bodhisattva career looks like, right? Here I want to draw a quote again from another scholar. This is Donald Lopez Jr. And from his book Hiecho's Journey, another one that I enjoy quite a lot. And here he says that these stories, by which he means Jatakas, could easily be Buddhified with the addition of a standard Jataka frame. The Buddha introduces the story at the beginning and he identifies the characters with Buddhist figures, most importantly himself, at the end, thereby transforming a simple folk tale about a monkey or a deer into an account of a past life of the Buddha himself. Bedtime stories become sacred texts. Now, I do think that, with all due respect to Lopez here, it's a little bit flippant. Uh, they weren't all simple folk tales or something like that. Some of them are quite intricate. They have plot lines that's something you'd find in like Shakespeare or Tolkien in many cases. Some of them are just as long as those sorts of novels, modern novels. So there's an incredible diversity to the Jatakas that this framing in particular doesn't acknowledge. However, the point overall is quite apposite that um, this framing process is what brought them into Buddhist view and enculturated them into the tradition, such that now they're an important source of literature, art, thinking, philosophy, things like that. So they're very integral. But they began as not Buddhist, and they became Buddhist through enculturation. Uh, Another example here is a story that you might know quite well is the parable of the blind man and the elephant. This is another case similar to the five precepts and to the Jatakas where it predates the Buddhist tradition. For example, in the Vedic literature, you find this same story kind of tied to this moral here that reality is one and that wise men speak of it differently. The Jains, for example, used it a different way. They said the immature deny what they don't know. And Buddhists used it to say every perspective holds some truth, but not all of it. I got to back up just a little bit to tell a little bit about this story or the sort of metaphor that's used here. In this example, five men, or usually about five blind men, are brought to an elephant and asked to touch it in different places, and then asked to say what an elephant is based on what they touched. Right? They can't see the elephant, but one blind man says the elephant is a wall because it's touching the side. Another says the elephant is a pillar because it's touching the leg. Another says the elephant is like a doormat because he's holding the ear. The other says it's like a rope because it's holding the tail. And when they all hear each other say what the elephant is, they begin to bicker with one another about what they've experienced, right? They've only seen or experienced, I should say, part of the elephant, and they think that they're right because they've experienced only the part that they have. So this metaphor or story, if you will, is used in various different ways. For example, much later in Indian history, Sufi Muslims would take up this story as well to say, the poet Rumi, for example, said, only your senses only tell part of the story. And then much later on, Christians would come along and find this story too when the British colonized India, and they would use it in different ways. So one Christian author, for example, says theologians will fight over things that they've never seen, using the parable of the blind men and the elephant as an illustration of how theologians fight over these arcane issues of doctrine. So my point here again is that this started out as something pan-Indian, non-Buddhist in character, and it's applied in various different ways by various traditions. However, Buddhists have made it their own by putting their own perspective on it. And I'm going to come back to this story a little later on in my presentation, noting here that I've got about another 15 minutes to go. This is my last set of the examples in its devotion to one's parents in Chinese Buddhism. Uh, Buddhism was integrated into China over a number of centuries, from the early, like the first century of the before the Common Era and into the middle of the first millennium. So about a 600 to 700 year process of integration, and part of that was a clash of values between, on the one hand, the Buddhist kind of desire or ultimate goal of achieving enlightenment through monastic practice, right? That this was deemed the most spiritual and highly elevated form of life, right? But this need to engage in monastic practice, particularly leaving behind one's family and the responsibilities that one has to their family, came into serious conflict with the Confucian values surrounding the obligations of particularly children to their parents, right? So in the Confucian Chinese world, uh, children had sort of three primary responsibilities to their parents. One of which was to take care of them in their old age, right? Because their parents are taking care of them. They need to repay the kindness of their parents by looking after them in their old age. They also need to tend to the family shrine. So those ancestors who have passed on need attending to in the form of particular rituals that need to be done in order to propitiate the ancestors and to provide a lineage, right? To become, get married themselves, reproduce, have kids, ideally men, right? Because this is a deeply patriarchal society, so they want boys to pass down the father's lineage of the family name, right? And I think much of the same value holds in Western cultures as well, or patriarchal and patrilineal society, right? So the obligations of children to their parents and to future generations, on the one hand, clash with this Buddhist desire to engage in monastic practices, right? Because obviously, if you're leaving behind your family and not having a family of your own and not being able to do the proper rituals in order to propitiate your ancestors, this is going to be a huge problem, right? So Buddhists had to figure out how to integrate ideals of what's called filial piety or devotion to one's parents, as I'm putting it here, into Buddhist frameworks. And part of this was done in the creation of new texts, in particular, sort of a locus classicus for this is called the Sutra on Parental Benevolence. It has a somewhat longer title, the Sutra on the Difficulty of Repaying the Kindness of Parents, but I've kind of squished it down here just for ease of memory. And so this particular text makes the claim that doing Buddhist practices is actually much more of a form of devotion to one's parents because it can help them get out of the cycle of samsara and closer to nirvana, right? So it reintegrates these values along Buddhist lines, right? It enculturates them through texts as well as through practices, right? What are called the Ulambana rituals, and I'm going to get into that in just another slide here. And so these non-Buddhist values of devotion to one's parents in this particular format become Buddhist by getting integrated through texts and through practices. Again, so we're kind of seeing a pattern of adaptation and evolution and reorienting of values in this process of enculturation going on. So in addition to the Sutra on Parental Benevolence, we also get another text in the kind of early Chinese tradition called the Ulambana Flower Sutra. Also, it's known as Mulian rescues his mother. And here, Mulian is the Buddhist disciple Moggallana or Moggallana, known in various traditions. But Mulian is the Chinese rendering of that name. And so this is a mashup of two different stories from Indian sources. One from which, Mulian or Moggallana is the main character, for another which is another disciple of the Buddha, Shariputra, is the main character. In them, they encounter hungry ghosts who are either relatives of theirs at one point in time, um, or just kind of like hungry ghosts who are just out there in the world, right? In the case of Mulian, he encounters 500 hungry ghosts who were merchants in a previous life and had committed grave acts of karmic evil previously and were beseeching Mulian to help him or to help them by making offerings to the Buddha in order to get them a better rebirth in their next life, right? And so part of these stories sets the groundwork for these Ulambana rituals, which is making offerings of food, water, gifts, material goods to the Sangha on the 15th day of the seventh month. Now, this might sound familiar to a number of my fellow Jodo Shinshu members of the audience, and I'm going to make that connection in just a little bit. But this is sort of the basis. This is the textual basis for that, for the practices that we see coming around um, that time of the year and the relationship of it to hungry ghosts, also to parents, right? So in the story of Mulian rescues his mother, these Indian stories are adapted to be that Mulian finds, is able to see his mother in hell, right? He goes to the hells and realizes his mother's there and he wants to rescue her so badly. So he goes back to the Buddha and says, "What do I need to do?" He recommends the Ulambana ritual, which is successful, and his mother is reborn in a heavenly realm, right? And this is seen as a highest act of filial piety, of parental devotion, right? Of saving one's parents from a hellish outcome of their life, and getting them closer and closer to achieving nirvana. And it's done through Buddhist practices. It's not done just through the traditional notions of filial piety, right? And this story, Mulian rescues his mother, becomes a classic of Chinese literature. It also becomes the basis of what's called the Ghost Festival or Parents' Day in Chinese culture. Uh, there's this the Ghost Festival is often about giving money or giving food and nice things to one's ancestors, particularly on the 7th day of the 15th day of the 7th month of the lunar calendar, right? So it often happens, think in mid to late August, right? Something like that. I don't know the exact lunar calendar, and it always shifts a little bit because it's lunar, it's not solar. Anyway, so this story has an important, huge impact on Chinese culture as well as Japanese culture, because from the values and the traditions that this story sets out, we get what are as I'm calling kind of important pillars of Shin Buddhist lived spirituality. One of which is obon, right? So that word bon comes from the Japanese rendering of the Chinese rendering of the Sanskrit word ulambana. The bon, right, comes Chinese, it becomes yulan pen, and then Japanese bon, right? So that's that shortening of that word, and the name is called, referring back to that sutra where Moggallana or Mulian saves his mother. And then the next value we get is ho'on or gratitude, right? That in this ideas of devotion to one's parents, there's also this notion of repaying kindness. That's what ho'on really means, but I'm rendering it here as gratitude, right? So there's a sense that we have a deep indebtedness to those who have come before us and given us the things of our life that make them good, right? And a part of that is the Buddha himself, the teachings that we have, and those who preserve them over time, right? This is I think, from my experience in Jodo Shinshu communities, this is a deeply held part of the lived value of this tradition. It's not necessarily Honganji doctrine per se, but it's very important in the lives of most Jodo Shinshu practitioners that they understand the connections they have to their past through their parents and those who come before them, and to express gratitude to the Buddha and to their family. Right. This is often done through use of like family altars, things like that, having pictures of loved ones that have deceased, and recognizing them as part of that spiritual community that they honor through using their home shrines, and then they honor on Obon as well as different parts of the year during the memorial services each month, depending on when they've passed away. So I guess my point here is that these enculturated values of gratitude and the Ulambana rituals provide the basis for what we think of really as Shin Buddhist spirituality today, or at least two really important key components of it. So we see then how things like precept practice, stories, metaphors, and values around devotion to one's parents all become Buddhist, all become part of what we think of Buddhism as today through this process of enculturation. And now I see I've got about 5 more minutes left, and I'm nearly done with my slides. So thank you so much to you guys for being patient and letting me get to my conclusion here. So in Jodo Shinshu temples today, as well as temples in other communities as well, we see that there's a number of different things that get labeled as sort of cultural practices or cultural activities. I have here, for example, flower arranging, ikebana, or culinary experiences like, the food bazaars that are often done, or, a number of other temples in different communities do, food trucks or food stands on the weekends. Say like I'm based in the LA area, and Wat Thai LA, a huge Thai Buddhist Theravada temple in North Hollywood, every weekend has food trucks and food stands of Thai food, and it's really great stuff. But they use that as a way to support their temple, right? And it's not necessarily religious. You don't have to go into the temple at all or be Buddhist to be involved with it. We also do things like Boy Scouts and basketball, right? In many of the social halls and gyms that are attached to temples these days, that's where a lot of cultural activities like Boy Scouts and basketball happen, right? And sometimes, unfortunately, it seems that there's kind of two components of our communities. Those that are involved, say, with the cultural side, and those who are involved with the Buddhist side, right? Those who show up to temple on Sunday, and then there's others who, are coming on the weekdays to drop off their kids to do basketball or showing up for a meeting of their Boy Scout troop, right? And it seems sort of like ne'er the twain shall meet. Uh, they're operating in parallel, not really communicating with one another. And unfortunately, what we find in the Buddhist spaces is that there's a disparagement of those who are engaged in cultural activities, saying that this is a drain on our ability to teach the Dharma. They're not focused on it. And I want to kind of reframe the conversation around these two parts, seemingly two parts of our communities, because I think that each of these things has its own way of being enculturated into a Buddhist perspective, a Buddhist worldview. We just have to see it and find ways to build those bridges and to respect the different ways that people engage with the Dharma through various means. So I want to give just one example flower arranging. And when I kind of thought about this in the initial presentation I was making for OCBC, uh, I kind of thought this had to do with the sort of meditative act of arranging the flowers just so, like, you have a picture of it in your mind, and you need to make sure that you're very carefully and mindfully placing the flowers into your pot just the way you want them. And that stillness and calmness, that precision and intention is kind of building a sort of discipline or a mindfulness, right? However, a dear friend of mine, Reverend Blake Honda from the Oxnard Buddhist Temple, gave me a different perspective on what Ikebana can mean, or flower arranging can mean, especially from a Jodo Shinshu context. And so what he said to me is just as we select each flower for our arrangement, Amida Buddha has selected us as the recipients of his wisdom and compassion, right? So just as we pick the flowers, the Buddha has picked us, right? Especially those of us who are ordinary people, not spiritual superstars who are on our way to enlightenment in this life, right? And the lesson here is that we are worthy just as we are, right? We're worthy of that compassion, right? And that the Buddha has selected us just like we select the flower. I thought that was a really moving way to think about Ikebana, right? Not as just a cultural practice that is kind of culturally or historically contingently tied to Buddhism because it comes from Japan, but it's actually a Buddhist practice because it helps us understand the worldview that we inhabit, right? I mean, there's also the basic fact that these things are done in Buddhist institutions, right? That was part of it for Collins when we think about that quote from before. They get sermonized, they get understood, they get practiced within the Buddhist institutions. That's part of what makes them Buddhist. We're doing them here at the temple together, or we could be, right? Sometimes we're not. And that's where I want to come back to the um, the parable of the elephant and the blind man. I realize I'm almost out of time. Do I have time just for this last slide here?
Yeah, yeah. It's no rush, Sensei. You're doing
Okay,
fine.
okay, great. I just want to make sure I'm respecting the time. So, how this gets incorporated, oh, that was my timer. How this gets incorporated into Buddhist thought is through a particular text called the Titiya Sutta in Pali, or Tirthiya Sutra, or the Sutra on Others, basically, is what it's called. And so in this story, there's a group of the Buddha's disciples headed into the town of Sravasti. And in Sravasti, they find in the public square a bunch of different teachers from other traditions, all bickering with one another about various doctrines. They're disparaging each other, refuting each other, nearly at blows with one another because they're in such heated debate. And this shocks the disciples of the Buddha. So they think, this is really quite astonishing. We need to go back to our teacher and talk about what we've seen today. So they explain what they saw to the Buddha, and he says, this is just like the story of the blind men and the elephant, which he then goes on to say and provides this verse as the lesson to be taken from that parable, which is some ascetics and Brahmins, it seems, cling to these things, arguing, they quarrel. The folk who just see one part, right? So what he's trying to say there is that all these teachers, they only have one little bit of the truth, and they don't have the humility to recognize that others might see things a little bit differently. And if they all came together, they could see the truth a little bit better if they just stopped fighting with one another all the time, right? It seems also fitting for a number of different situations, even in the contemporary world too, right? But I'm going to apply it just to our Buddhist communities, and to kind of think about what's going on there using this parable. And that Buddhism becomes like a big elephant, and we're all only touching one little part. So, such that some of us will say, Buddhism is studying the sutras. Buddhism is chanting the Nembutsu, another will say. Another will say Buddhism is teriyaki chicken. Another will say Buddhism is basketball. Another will say Buddhism is obon or the dancing that's done at the obon festivals every year in the summertime. Or Buddhism is memories of grandma, that, how they understand Buddhism is their relationship to their family, especially um, parents or grandparents who have gone before them, right? And passed the tradition down to them. What I want to say here is that we're all seeing one part of it, right? And we're now in the process of kind of bickering with one another about what the Buddhism is. But it's really, we're all just seeing one little part of the elephant. And my challenge or my provocation is that we can try to see a little bit more, and we can engage with folks who are seeing something different than us. Go into that conversation with a little bit of um, open-mindedness to see where is it that we're not um, finding that tradition as they have it. I think this for me, speaking to myself, um, I didn't grow up Buddhist. I didn't grow up in Jodo Shinshu communities, so I have no family connection, right? But this was something I had to understand and appreciate from talking to BCA temple members across various, churches and temples, to understand the depth of that sense of connection and gratitude, and how it enables them to see the interconnectedness that we all experience. We get it through different means. Maybe it's through studying the sutras or doing something else, playing basketball, right? But we've all got our different ways of engaging. And I want to say not that one is more authentic than the other, but actually that they're all valid ways of engaging with the Dharma. And so that will get me to my closing questions here, which are the following. Um, what part of the elephant do you notice? Which part do you not see? And then which parts of the elephant have you not engaged with and why? What dharma is present in the activities we call cultural, for example, basketball, food bazaar, language classes, or movie nights, right? And can humility and an open mind bridge the gaps in our communities? So with that, thank you so much. That's all I've got for you today. So I'm really excited to hear from y'all. See what questions you have, or if you have responses to the questions that I've posed. Because again, thank you for letting me be here.